So as I mentioned in the previous videos, we're going to be building custom markers that are a little different than the plain ones. So these are what they're going to look like down here on the screen. And this is quite a more involved process than just making the plain old markers that come default with the Google Maps SDK. These you actually need to use something called clusters to make these. And I could look through the docs, but I thought it would be better if I just kind of gave you the bullet points of what this process is going to be like, and then we practically went through it. So kind of step one of this process is actually getting the dependency. You can't just use the Google Maps SDK. We need to get a special dependency for creating these clusters. Second is going to be creating an object class that implements ClusterItem. So it's going to be a plain old Java object that implements the ClusterItem class. And I'm going to show you that in the documentation in just a second here. Third is building a cluster renderer class. So because these cluster items use images, we need to build a class that actually renders those images. And the fourth is going to be actually adding the cluster item objects to the map. So if we look at the completed version of the app, these are cluster items, and here they are on the map. So let's take a quick look at the docs. This is an example of a cluster item. So you can see they call it my item, and it implements the cluster item class. And there's three main parameters. So there's a latitude and longitude, which describes its position in space, where it lives on the map. It has a string of a title and a string for a snippet. So if we look at the completed version of the app, obviously the position, that latitude and longitude parameter is where it exists on the map. If I click one, it shows a title above, so this one's Mitch Tabian, and the snippet is "This is you." If I click this one, the title is Mitch, the snippet is "Determined route to Mitch." So this is kind of the most general thing you need to do to build a class that implements ClusterItem. Ours is going to have a few extra parameters because we're going to add a few extra features, but in the most general sense, this is how you do it. Okay, so let's start on step one, which is going to be getting the dependency. I believe the dependency is actually on this page somewhere. Let me take a look. No, okay, I don't see it. Possibly in the setup guide. There you go. So that's the dependency that you need to use the cluster item. So you can see use one of these utilities from the library, such as marker clustering, heat maps, or other utilities. So you'll want to copy that, and then let's go to Android Studio, and we need to put that into the build.gurl app file. I believe I did already. Nope, looks like I didn't. Okay, so I'll just do Google Map utils for clustering, and I'm going to paste that down here. Whoops, need to remove the dependency and change this to implementation. So that is the dependency that we need to use clustering. So I'm going to go ahead and sync that, and that's good to go. So next step is actually building our class that implements ClusterItem. So I'm going to right click on the models package, and I'm going to call this one marker cluster. Actually, we'll call it cluster marker. Cluster marker. And of course we need to implement the ClusterItem class, and now you can see it's giving us some errors. So I'm going to press Alt Enter on here, implement methods, and you can see it's telling me I need a position, I need a title, and I need a snippet. So you can click that. You don't really have to do that. I could actually just write it out manually, which is what I'm going to do. So private latitude longitude object, which is going to be the position, private string title, and private string snippet. So those are the three things that are required for this class. But we're going to add a few extras. Number one is we need an image. So I'm going to go private, and all the images are going to be stored in the drawables folder, so they can be integer resources. So these are going to be pointers to the images in memory. I'm going to call it icon picture, and we're going to use one more object. It's going to store a user object. That way each of the clusters, each of the icons on the map will have a user object attached to it, so it'll have the position, a title, a snippet, an icon describing what it looks like, and it's also going to hold a reference to a user object. This is just going to make things much easier for us later if we ever need to figure out which marker is whose, if we have a reference to that user object. It just makes things easier. Now I'm going to press Alt Insert and get the default constructor. Pass all those parameters. I'm going to close this so we have more room. I'm going to copy this, paste it below, and we're going to get an empty constructor here, so one that takes nothing. And now I'm going to insert the getter and setter methods, and that error is going to go away. There we go. We could also do a toString method, but not really necessary. Basically, that's only for debugging. So now we're going to build the class that's responsible for actually rendering the images on the cluster items. So I'm going to put it in the util package. I'm going to right click on the util package, go to new, and I'm going to call this my cluster manager renderer. So pretty long name. This is going to extend the default cluster renderer class, and we need to specify a type, which is the class that we just made. So that this is our cluster item class, which is the cluster marker class that we just made. So you can see it's giving me some warnings, so I'm going to click on that, press Alt Enter, and it's telling me I need to insert a constructor. But before I insert a constructor, I want to define all the parameters that I need for this class. So the first one is going to be something called a icon, so private final icon generator, and I'm going to call it icon generator. This is going to be responsible for most of the rendering. It is responsible for the rendering of the images. Next, we have an image view. Obviously, we need an image view because we're displaying an image on the icon on the cluster. And then we have two more variables. One's going to be the marker width, so how big it is, and the other one is going to be the marker height, so how wide it is and how high it is. And I want to make this final two. Okay, so now we can insert that default constructor. So I'm pressing Alt Insert, grabbing the constructor, all the parameters. I'm going to close this so we have more room, because that took up a ton of room. There we go. And so there we go. We have there's kind of our starting point. Now inside the constructor, we want to initialize all these variables. So the icon generator equals new icon generator. We want to do context.getApplicationContext, and that's all that needs. And the image view, we're adding a new image view, so equals new image view. We need a reference to the context, getApplicationContext, and that's also all that needs. The marker width we'll do first. Specify an integer type, context.get resources, get dimensions, and r.dimen r.dimen.custom marker image. So I've added those to the dimensions folder, and actually I can just copy that line, and this one's going to be the same for the marker width, or sorry, marker height. Same thing. Next is setting the layout parameters to the image view. So set layout params, new view group, layout parameters, and we want to pass the marker width and that marker height. Next, we're going to set some padding to the images. So integer padding equals integer context get resources get dimensions. Once again, we're going to reference that dimensions folder, but I'm going to use the custom marker padding that I've added into there. Now set everything to that image view. So image view set padding, and we want to do padding, and padding. So that's the left top, right, and bottom for all the padding. And then we want to do icon generator dot set content view, and then we want to pass that image view. So all of this is responsible for getting the icon generator ready to go, setting up the image view, setting the width, the height of the image view, setting the padding of the image view, and then associating that image view with the icon generator. Alright, so the next part, we need to insert some override methods. So I'm going to press Control O, and I'm going to search for on before cluster item rendered. So we have on before cluster rendered, and we have on before cluster item rendered. We're actually not using clusters in this course. We're only using the cluster items itself. If you're confused by what that means, we can go back to the documentation. And so a cluster item in itself is kind of like this standalone image here, but a cluster is a grouping of cluster items. So you can see this one is 2 cluster items, 2 cluster items, 3 cluster items, 1 cluster item. So in this course, we're just using cluster items that stand alone. We're not using the actual clustering itself of those cluster items. So hopefully that makes sense. So we're only interested in on before cluster item rendered. That's the one we want to get. we can delete the super, and now we're going to write some custom stuff in here. So we want to do image view, set image resource, do item.getIconPicture, because remember we have that icon picture parameter inside of our cluster class. That's this icon picture parameter right here. So we're setting the image view to that resource. Now we're going to do bitmap icon equals icon generator dot make icon. That's going to generate the icon from the generator. Now I'm going to do marker options dot icon, and then we want to do bitmap descriptor factory dot from bitmap, and then pass that bitmap, or sorry, pass the bitmap which is named icon, and we want to set the title. So set, so title, and then item dot get title. So that's actually it. That's all we need to do to render a custom image to a cluster item. There's one last method we need though, so I'm going to press Control O again, and that's going to be should render as cluster. As I said just a few moments ago, we're not going to be dealing with any clustering, so I'm going to insert this method and return false, meaning I don't want any clustering to ever occur at any point. If you wanted it to occur, you would change this to true. So I encourage you to actually play around with that. Change that to true. Whatever number you put here is the number of items that will. Oh, it's a Boolean. So you would have to return a Boolean value depending on how many you wanted to cluster. But like I said, we're not going to be dealing with that. So I'm just going to return false. All right, so the last step is actually building a method to insert, so to kind of create all the cluster items for all the users who are in the chat room, and then add those to the map. So let's go into our user list fragment class, and there's going to be a lot of code here, so I might just insert it actually and then walk through it. So the method is going to be private void add map markers. Going to return nothing and take nothing, and I'm actually just going to copy this from the code for the course. So I've just copied it and I'm going to paste it in, and we're just going to walk through it. So I'm just going to import everything. I'm just pressing Alt Insert on all these imports here, and we need to create a couple objects. So before I go through this, I'll create these objects. We need a cluster manager object and a cluster manager render object, which is what we used up there. So I'm going to scroll up to the top, go private cluster manager, I'll call it M cluster manager, and private my cluster renderer. I think we called it M, let's see what the name is, M cluster manager renderer. There we go. Now I'm going to scroll back down. Not sure why that's giving me an error, but and then we also need a list of all the cluster markers. So okay, let's go up to the top again. Just bear with me here. I'm gonna walk through all this. So cluster marker M cluster markers goes new array list. So that's good. Okay. Looks like the constructor is wrong. I'm just gonna go back into the my cluster manager renderer class and look at the constructor. Oh, I see. So we're not passing the marker width and the marker height. Sorry, I don't need to set that. And what else is there? I think that's it. These are in the wrong order now though. So context, Google Map. Oh, we're actually also not passing the icon generator, so we can delete that. So all we should have in here is context, Google Map, cluster manager, and image view. Oh no, actually not image view either. We're not passing the image view. That's being declared in here. So we can delete these. Okay, there we go. So all we need, we're passing the context, the Google Map, and the cluster manager to the constructor, and that's exactly what we're doing here. Okay, because everything else is instantiated inside the constructor. So the icon generator is instantiated here. The image view is also instantiated here. Marker width and marker height are, so we don't need to pass those to the constructor, obviously. Okay, so now we're back into user list fragment. So let's walk through this method. So the objective of this method is to loop through all of the users who are in the chat room, create a cluster item for them, or a cluster marker for them. So a cluster marker is this object class that we created right here, and then we want to add all of those to the map. So first thing we want to do is make sure that the Google map is not null. After that, we want to, if the cluster manager is null, we want to create a new cluster manager. So we pass the context and then we pass the Google map to create a new cluster manager. We haven't talked about the cluster manager yet, but basically there's three things kind of involved in creating cluster items and adding them to the map. There's the cluster manager, there's the cluster manager renderer, and then there's the cluster item itself. So that's we created a custom cluster item with the cluster marker class, and we created a custom cluster renderer with the myClusterManager renderer class. But we didn't create a custom cluster manager. That's just the default cluster manager that comes with the dependency. Next, so if our custom cluster manager renderer is null, we want to create a new one of those. So we pass the context, we pass a reference to the Google map, and we also pass a cluster manager. So that's the constructor that we made here. We pass the context, the Google map, and the cluster manager. Next, we want to associate the cluster manager with the cluster manager renderer. So we use setRenderer on the cluster manager object. After that, it's mostly all set up, like everything, all the objects are associated with what they need to be. There's the cluster manager knows what the Google map is, and the cluster manager renderer knows what its renderer is. It also has a reference to the Google map. So after that, we can start working on adding them to the map. So that's what this loop is here. You can see we're looping through the user locations, and then we're creating cluster markers for each individual user. So you get the snippet is decided by whether or not the location, or sorry, the user location, the user ID of it is the currently authenticated user. Because in that case, the marker should just say this is you, which is what we see on the completed version of the app. If I click on the one that is at my location, then I can see the snippet says this is you. Otherwise, it says determine route to whoever that user is, which is what we see with this if-else statement. If it's me, then it's this is you. Otherwise, it says determine route to name. Next is the part for setting the image. So the default avatar is r.drawable.CodingWithMitch logo. That's just my logo. That's going to be the default image if there is no avatar selected. But if the user does have an avatar selected, then it gets it from the getAvatar method on the user object. Let me show you Firestore really quick here so that you remember where the avatar is. So if we go into the users collection, each user has this avatar parameter. So if I go to either of them, they all have an avatar selected. That avatar is a pointer in memory to that drawable resource. So if I look at the drawables file here, you can see we have a bunch of them. That. And if you remember from the application, you can change your avatar by going to profile and then just selecting something from here. That will change your avatar in the database. So now if I go to the map, you can see that avatar has changed. That's all that is. The last part is creating the cluster marker and then adding that to the map. So you can see I instantiate a new cluster marker class. I set it up by passing the position, so the latitude and longitude position, the title, which in this case is the username, the snippet, which is either this is you or determine route to name, the avatar, and then of course a reference to the user. Just so those are all the parameters that we declared up here. We have the position, title, snippet, the avatar, and then the reference to the user object. Now to actually add that cluster item to the map, we need to call the addItem method on the cluster manager. So you can see I'm calling addItem and then I'm passing the cluster. But I'm also passing the cluster item to the cluster markers array list. Now this isn't actually adding it to the map, it's just for later. That way we have an easy reference to a list of all the markers that have been added to the map, because the cluster manager doesn't have any methods for easily retrieving the markers that are added to it. So instead I just created an array list in parallel with it so that we have a reference to all the markers that are on the map. And of course catching a null pointer, because I can't remember which of these could be null. But it's always good to catch the null pointer just in case it's going to prevent your crash. At the end of the loop, so you can see the loop closes right here, we need to call cluster on the cluster manager. If you don't call cluster on the cluster manager, all of it won't be added to the map. So it's kind of like a last step. It's like, okay, I'm ready. add everything to the map, you always need to call cluster. And then of course at the end of that we're setting the camera view. So that's the method. That's creating cluster items, that's creating a custom renderer. This is everything you need to know to create custom markers and then add them to the map. The last part of this is, where do we call this method? Where do we call add map markers? Well, the logical place that I think is, since we're calling set camera view, we might as well call it where set camera view was, and that was called down in the onMapReady method. So right here we can go add map markers. The markers will get added to the map, and then the camera view will get centered on the authenticated user. Now, since this video is quite long, I'm actually not going to test it in this video. We're going to test it in the next video, because I think we're probably around 20 minutes by now. I wanted to make sure that I included the cluster marker stuff, the cluster renderer stuff, and then also building the method to add them to the map all in one video. So testing is going to be kind of another thing on its own. So we're going to take a look at that in the next video.